Okay, I think we're about ready to start the debate in the room. We have Angstreich and Shotgun Smith. If somebody would take the dots off of those two people, and I'm not sure who wants to go first. How we're going to do this is have a debate lasting 40 minutes, and each person will have 20 minutes to use as they see fit. So, however long, if they want to get on the mic and talk for 20 minutes and use up all their time, that's fine. But divide it up as you will. And we'll continue until each person uses up their 20 minutes. Shotgun, would you like to go first? Okay, that's fine. Shotgun, go ahead and come to the mic then. Take as long as you like.
Okay, can you guys hear me? Unfortunately, I've been having some computer issues, so if I cut out or something, we're going to have to be patient with that. Or as the atheists in the room might say, I ran in cowardly fear. But as the Christian should know, it's just because of technical issues if I do happen to drop out. So, tonight's the debate. For those of you who do not know, what we're going to do is we are going to be debating ethics. Most likely, the focus of our debate will center on meta-ethics and concerning meta-ethical issues. So I just want to start off by saying that I think it's really good timing that we're having this discussion so close to Christmas time. As you guys know, Christmas is the time that we Christians celebrate the birth of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. He is our King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Just like the song says, joy to the world, the Lord is come. Let earth receive her King. Let every heart prepare him room, and heaven and nature sing. He rules the world with truth and grace, and makes the nations prove the glories of his righteousness and wonders of his love. Jesus Christ is King over this world, and his will determines what is right and what is wrong. Now, not everyone obviously believes that Jesus Christ is the King. I see some of the people in the chat room are griping and crying about it. I mean, as a matter of fact, some people not only reject the idea of Jesus as King, but they reject the idea of a divine Lord altogether. How crazy is that? And they go even further and reject the idea of binding ethical obligations at all. In other words, they say there's no such thing as ethical obligations. And my opponent this evening is one of those, at least I think he is. But anyway, tonight I want to argue that Jesus Christ is our King, and that the idea of the philosophical position of moral anti-realism should be rejected. So is everybody clear on what is going to be happening? I am going to be arguing that moral anti-realism should be rejected as an ethical position. Now, a few preliminary things I have to get out of the way, because not everybody in this room is a Christian. A lot of you are atheists or agnostics or what have you. So the first preliminary I need to get out of the way, number one, I am a Reformed Christian. I hold to the Westminster Confessional Standards. That means I'm a Calvinist and a Presbyterian. And the Westminster Confessional Standards imply a deontological theory of divine command ethics. And I believe this is best expressed by Dr. John Frame in his triperspectival view, which I know nobody really in here probably knows what that is, but I hope to get a chance to expound on that later during the discussion. But this is the view that I will be defending and arguing for, so I hope everybody knows that for the rest of this discussion, that when I say things like the Christian worldview, or when I talk about Christianity or Christian ethics, I want you guys to understand that I'm talking about this narrow definition. I'm not talking about just any old Christianity. I'm talking about a narrow focus here. So the second preliminary that I need to get out of the way, and this is kind of odd, but number two, it's really odd that tonight I find myself on the same side with every popular atheist I ever read. It's funny, but every popular atheist I've ever read wants to be moral realist. right? Georgia H. Smith, in his book Atheism, The Case Against God, he uses Ayn Rand's objectivist epistemology to try to argue for moral realism and the reality of values that we should follow. Obviously, Sam Harris. You guys are familiar with Sam Harris. Sam Harris certainly has a theory of moral realism. Further, who else? I mean, Richard Carrier. I've got Richard Carrier's book, Sense and Goodness Without God, and he spends a large part of the book trying to establish a moral realist position. Bertrand Russell, even, the great Bertrand Russell, in his book, Why I'm Not a Christian, in his essay on the Good Life, argues for a moral realist position, and at the end, he basically says that I don't know what the good life is objectively. I just hope as many people agree with me about it as I can. But at any rate, these are all moral realists. And I am tonight going to be defending a moral realist position. And so I'm on the side of all of these atheists. They want to say that there is something to the idea of an ethical proposition. So the next preliminary that I want to get to. As part of this second preliminary, I just wanted to point out that I have no idea really what position Angst holds here. Angstreich, for those of you listening via podcast or some other means, my opponent's name is Angstreich, and I don't know what position he holds to. He told me that he holds to a moral anti-realist position, but that is such an ambiguous phrase. It can be widely applied. It is compatible with a great many number of ethical positions, metaphysical positions. It's compatible with a lot of different positions. By the way, it's even compatible with Christianity. There are some Christian moral anti-realists, so that's odd. But anyway, I hope that whatever I critique, he doesn't get on the mic and say that I'm critiquing a straw man, and if he does, I'll just use my argument. But I guess that's what it gets. That's what you get for never explaining your position in a chat room for fear of having it critiqued. At any rate, this leads me to my last of my preliminary observations. Have you guys all heard of the God of the gaps argument? A lot of naive Christians argue for the God of the gaps. If the atheist can't come up with some explanation of if the atheist can't come up with some explanation for some phenomenon, the Christian says, aha, I got you, God must have done it. Well, we all can see how silly that is. Hopefully most of you guys can see why the God of the gaps argument is bad. It shouldn't be used. What I want to do is I want to argue that my Framian triperspectival ethics is compatible with a large number of meta-ethical theories. So if Angst tonight is able to critique, say, William Lane Craig's version of divine command ethics, and say Angst is able to overcome that, well, then I can just use someone else's. I can just move to John Hare's. And if John Hare's is defeated, then what about Robert Adams's view? I mean, so there's many different views. As long as they're compatible with some sort of reformed theology, then I don't really, I don't have a dog in that fight. So let Angst critique these. I just want to point out that the last thing here I want to say is that even if I am unable to defend any divine ethic, divine command theory this evening, I just want it known that still does not prove that atheism or moral skepticism is to fill the gap. Do you see? So what Angst has to do is come up with an argument that refutes divine command ethics in general. And I have no idea how he's going to do that. So that's the preliminaries. Let me get on to just lay out how this argument is going to go. I have no idea how, like I said, how Angst is going to argue against my position. I can only speculate. He might offer an epistemological criticism against divine command theories. He might offer some sort of semantic arguments against theistic ethics. I don't know. But what I do know is some of the tools that he'll be using. He's going to have to use language to present case. He's going to have to talk. He's going to get on the mic, presumably, and talk. Second, he's going to probably try to use logic. logical argumentation. He wants to appeal to a theory of knowledge of some sort by which he can authoritatively discuss facts and evidence and things of that nature. Ultimately do is argue that if moral anti-realism were true, then Angst would not be able to utilize these tools of argumentation. So if Angst can't utilize these tools of argumentation without giving up the truth of his position, then he can't argue against me or against divine command theory unless he gives up the truth of his position. That's what I'm going to argue. Some of you will realize this is a sort of presuppositionalist argument, and I hope you guys are happy with that. How much time do I have left, guys? At any rate, I yield the mic and look forward to hear what Angst has to offer. Thank you.
All right, Angst, it's your turn. If you're in the room, please take the mic.
Can you hear me at all? Can anybody? Oh, you can hear me. Okay, great. All right. So Shotgun said that God's will determines what is right and what is wrong. So what is the argument for that claim? I yield the mic.
I'm not sure you're justified to even ask the question. Can you give me some sort of reason why I should allow you to utilize language as a moral anti-realist?
Oh, I see. So you don't actually have the argument? I thought you said you had the argument and that was what you were going to use the debate time for. So you don't actually have an argument that God's will determines what is right and wrong. Is that right? I yield the mic.
Well, actually, can you guys hear me? Okay. I argue for this transcendentally by demonstrating that in order for you to even speak and to ask me questions, you have to presuppose my position to be true to begin. That's the argument. And so unless you can provide some sort of non-Christian or non-moral realist position that justifies your use of language or your use of epistemology or your use of logic, then I'm not going to allow you to ask the question. I mean, you can ask the question all you would like, but it's not going to be morally, it's not going to be logically justified until you do some sort of work or provide some sort of reason for why I should take your question seriously. Thank you. I yield the mic.
So what is the argument that in order for me to be justified in using language, I have to presuppose that your position is true? Just give me that argument. You can give me that in terms of premises and a conclusion that validly follows from the premises. I yield the mic.
Well, I could do that, but again, I'm not sure why I should, because that would presuppose that I'm obligated to present logic for some reason, and I'm not sure why. I mean, given the truth of your position, why that would be a necessary thing to do. I mean, if I were going to do something like that, I would try to talk about the objective obligations that one has when using language that isn't allowed for, given a generic understanding of moral anti-realism. Perhaps you hold to some form of moral anti-realism that doesn't fall prey to that sort of criticism, and if you do, I'd be glad to hear it. But that said, again, I don't think you're justified to demand that I present to you a logic argument unless you can provide some reason that I should take logic seriously outside the Christian worldview. Now, if you would like to accept the truth of Christianity and argue from within a Christian paradigm, then certainly logical operations like premises and stating syllogisms and things of that sort would certainly come into play. But I don't think you're willing to do that. Thank you. I yield the mic.
Sorry, I'm a little confused here. Is there an argument that I'm not justified in using language unless I presuppose the truth of the Christian worldview or not? I'm not following. I yield the mic.
Well, I'm not sure why concepts would follow one from the other in your worldview anyway. That's what I'm confused about. So maybe you could explain why concepts have to logically follow each other. Thank you. I yield the mic.
Okay, I thought the debate was about meta ethics, and we were presupposing that logic works, since it works on my worldview, and presumably you believe that it works on your worldview as well. Now, if you think there's an argument that shows that logic doesn't work on my worldview, I'd be willing to entertain that argument if you have such an argument. If you don't have such an argument, then I just would be interested in knowing what the argument is for divine command metaethics, since you seem to think that there was such an argument, but it seems to be a mystery what that argument is. I yield the mic.
Well, I don't have to argue against your position, but I mean, I'm not going to just grant it to you either. I mean, if you want me to take your position seriously, the burden is on you to present some sort of reason why I should. I know that you prefer Christians just grant you these things, but I'm not kind enough to do so, sir. So please, if you would like to utilize logic in this discussion, you have to present some reason why I should take your logical proposition seriously. Thank you. I yield the mic.
Well, I haven't presented a position. I was trying to understand what your position is. It seems to be divine command metaethics, and all you've said about it is that God determines what is right or wrong. I was wondering if there's an argument for that claim. I yield the mic.
Well, you say you haven't, but you actually have, because you required that I present to you premises and a conclusion in a well-ordered, logical fashion, and that is you presupposing that we have to use logic in this discussion. And I'm not sure why we should do so within your worldview. You haven't given me a reason. You're just hoping that I grant out of the kindness of my heart. And I mean, I love you, and I'm praying for you that the Holy Spirit will touch your heart, but I'm not that kind. So if you would like to utilize logic in this discussion, if you would like for me to present to you a logical argument, then as a moral anti-realist, I'm not sure why or how logic can be utilized in your worldview, given the truth of moral anti-realism. Maybe you can explain that to me, and then maybe we can get moving with the discussion. Thank you. I yield the mic.
I'm not seeing any contradiction between the two. Maybe you can demonstrate the contradiction. I yield the mic.
Well, I'm not familiar enough with what your position even is to point out contradictions in it. You would have to be the one. I mean, presumably, if you would like to utilize logic from within the paradigm of your worldview, you're the one who has to give me some sort of reason why I should take you seriously when you try to do so. You know, it's not for me to try to prove or to do your work for you, to try to present to you a position that you can use to have the discussion. If you would like for me to do so, I could give you reasons why you can use logic from within a Christian paradigm. If you would like to operate within a Christian paradigm for the rest of the discussion, that would be fine with me. Thanks. Yield the mic.
Well, would you prefer to give me an illogical argument for divine command metaethics? Would that be more suitable to you? I yield the mic.
Well, it would certainly be easier, but from within a Christian worldview, I have to use logic because illogical arguments don't prove anything from within my perspective. If we're going to argue from the truth of your perspective, though, I'm not sure. I guess I would have to be using an irrational argument because I don't understand how you can use logical arguments from within a moral anti-realist position. By the way, just in case you guys want to know where I'm coming from, I mentioned earlier in my opening remarks that many non-Christian philosophers are moral realists, and for my arguments that I'm going to be using against angst this evening, I've been relying on Richard N. Boyd, a philosophy professor from Cornell, who is a moral realist, and he argues against anti-realism in various different ways. He points out naturalistic definition fallacy of moral anti-realism, moral motivation and rationality fallacies within anti-realism, the semantics of anti-realism. So I'm going to be utilizing some of these.
Great. No need to stand on ceremony. please feel free to utilize those arguments right away. Can't wait to hear them. I yield the mic.
Yes, but before we begin engaging in arguments, we have to agree on the conceptual scheme from which these arguments are going to be offered. And if moral anti-realism is true, then we wouldn't be able to utilize these conceptual schemes. The only way we can talk about these arguments, Angst, is if you give up the truth of moral anti-realism to begin with. And if that's what you're willing to do, then I would have won the debate. Would you like to do that?
Why that follows? Why is it that that's the only way? I yield the mic.
Well, it's not the only way. I mean, if by the only way you mean that there may be some way that as a moral anti-realist you could use language and utilize linguistic acts and talk about logic as if logical rules applied to you. If you could do that, then I would be happy to discuss arguments against moral anti-realism with you. But until you do, I don't really see why we should even engage in argumentation, since it's my position that if your position of moral anti-realism were true, then we wouldn't even be able to have the conversation to begin with.
Is there an argument for that claim? I yield the mic.
Oh, there are. There are many arguments for the claim, but all of them operate within a non-moral anti-realist position. So in order to present the arguments so that we can critique them, you would have to give up your position of moral anti-realism to begin with. And again, if you were willing to do that, that's fine with me. Just admit it on the mic.
Yeah, I'm not seeing why that follows. Maybe you can explain how that follows. I yield the mic.
Well, it follows because for various different reasons, I don't think a moral anti-realist could utilize things like language because of the objective rules required for linguistic acts. And I don't think a moral anti-realist can utilize things like logic because of the, again, objective rules required. But again, I mean, I could explain these things, but the only reason these arguments and these criticisms of moral anti-realism would make sense is because we're operating on a non-moral realist or moral anti-realist position. Thank you. I yield the mic.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any contradiction between objective rules and moral anti-realism. So I don't. Maybe you can show me why the two are in conflict. I yield the mic.
Well, that's not really what I'm here to do this evening. I'm here this evening to vindicate Christian truth claims, which require, if you're not going to offer an argument against them, then that's fine. That's fine with me. We can discuss the complexities of these arguments, in some other venue. I mean, the thing is, unless you give me a reason to take your argument serious, take logic seriously, then I don't understand why I should. I mean, you're not offering anything interesting. Thank you. I yield the mic.
To vindicate Christian truth claims, I'm inviting you to do so. So give me some vindication for Christian truth claims. Give everybody here some vindication. You haven't given any yet. That's what we're waiting for. I yield the mic.
Well, to vindicate Christian truth claims requires using things like language. It requires using things like logic, none of which you've given us any reason to think that you're justified in utilizing. So until you do, we're just going to keep going around in circles until you can provide some sort of meat to your position, which I understand why you don't want to do that, but if you're going to have to for us to move beyond this point, I'm afraid.
I'm not really sure I understand what it would mean to justify using those things. So maybe you can show me how the Christian justifies it on the Christian worldview, and we can then see whether that works. I yield the mic.
I'll be happy to do so if you admit publicly that you have to reject moral anti-realism in order for us to operate from within a Christian paradigm.
Well, I'd be happy to do that if I could see the argument that that's necessitated So maybe you can present the argument, and then if the argument is sound, I will do.
Have an argument, you have to give up the truth claims of moral anti-realism.
Well, you keep stating that, but it doesn't seem like you have an argument for showing that. So do you have an argument for that or not? I yield the mic.
Well, you can't ask me for an argument when your position doesn't allow for argumentation. Now, if you disagree with this, if you think that you can argue, and if you would like to try arguing, please do so. I invite you to try it. I invite you to try offering some sort of criticism of my position, and we'll see what happens. I mean, if you disagreed with my claim, then you could easily disprove it very quickly by just offering some sort of argument against my position, and then we can criticize the argument or the propositions that you offer to see if you're justified as a moral anti-realist in offering these arguments. Thank you.
Right. Well, I don't know what your position is. You haven't stated it. I yield the mic.
I stated my position very clearly in my opening remarks.
What position is that? That God determines what is right and wrong? Is that what you mean?
Well, I laid out in my opening remarks that I hold to a Christian theory of deontological ethics that is a form of divine command theory, and it's based on John Frame's triperspectival view. I mentioned this to you a week ago. I was hoping that you could look up John Frame and maybe have some criticisms ready. But I could go into a Framian view of ethics if you would like. But again, before you're allowed to critique it, you have to give me some reason why I should take your criticism seriously. Thank you. I yield the mic.
I haven't offered any criticisms. I just wanted to understand what the position is. So is the position that what God wills? Is that the idea? God's commands are determine whether something is good? I yield the mic.
Well, I wouldn't frame it that way because there's some problems that would crop up. I don't want to say that it's numerically identical, God's command and what the good is. But again, I mean, before I'm even able to have that discussion with you about my position, you have to vindicate yours, or at least give me some reason why things like asking questions is a legitimate enterprise for a moral anti-realist. I don't see why moral anti-realists can ask questions or do perform linguistic acts. Uh, that moral anti-realism, at least as my understanding of it, would invalidate the use of linguistic acts. Thank you. I yield the mic.
Yeah, you said that many times, but you don't seem to have an argument for the claim. So I'm just going to ignore it until you have an argument. All right. So God. So when we say that God determines what the good is by virtue of His commanding something, is that supposed to be an a priori identification? That is God's commands and the good, or I yield the mic.
Well, if you're going to ignore my arguments, to me, I just take that as a declaration of victory on my part. If you just don't want to argue, that's fine with me. If you just don't want to deal with these things, I feel unfortunate about that. I wish you would try to engage in reason and support yourself. But if you don't want to, I can't twist your arm and make you do it. As for as for a divine command theory and whether it's a posteriori or a priori, I would say it's a posteriori, only given God's divine simplicity. But God looks at His own character and determines His commands based on His character, and His commands are constrained by His character. So, for example, God is a loving God. That's a non-moral fact. God is a loving God, and as a result, He commands that murder is wrong. So that's a posteriori command. But at any rate, we're not even able to get at that point until you're able to provide some sort of justification for things like question asking linguistic acts. Thank you. I yield the mic.
Oh, let's be clear here. I didn't say I was going to ignore your arguments. I was going to ignore your announcement that you have an argument which you haven't provided. Right? So what you didn't actually give an argument that moral realism makes it impossible to deploy law. Anti-realism makes it impossible to employ logic or language. You just announced that there is an argument that shows that. So I said I was going to ignore your announcements for arguments that you have not yet presented. If you actually present an argument, I'll be glad to not ignore it and take it very seriously, but you haven't presented any arguments at all. Right. So I didn't think that the doctrine of divine simplicity was consistent with the theology of the Westminster Confession. My understanding was that that was a view that's used by Thomists. So I'm very surprised to hear you say that you subscribe to the doctrine of divine simplicity. But I guess the question is that I'm not understanding why God's nature is the way that it is, right? If God looks to his own nature and then commands in accord with what he sees in his own nature, right? Why is that not a mere naturalistic fallacy? It seems to me that you need some explanation for why God has the nature that he has, right? Because uh, an evil God, for example, could look at his own nature and give commands in accord with that nature. So I take it that you don't think that God's nature is actually good. Is that right? I yield the mic.
That is correct. God's nature is not moral, or God's nature is amoral. But at any rate, I only have 1 minute left. And way really quickly, the Reformed do hold to divine simplicity. That is not uniquely Thomist doctrine, or it is a Thomist doctrine, but it's fairly well accepted by most evangelicals. And I want to correct something you said. I did not tell you that I have an argument. I didn't announce that I had an argument against moral anti-realism and the usage of it, although I did claim that I had some arguments in reserve. What I was saying is that I was announcing I'm not going to take your statement seriously unless you do provide something of substance or give me some reason why. That's not an argument. That's me telling you what I'm going to be doing. I'm not going to take anything you say seriously unless you provide a justification for doing so. So I guess my time is up. This has been good. I'm going to stay here and listen to you, Angst. I guess you have a long amount of time now to close, and then I suppose we're going to take questions or something. I don't know, maybe the admin can say if we're going to take questions and how that's going to work. But anyway, thank you. I yield the mic.
Okay, well, in the remainder of my time, let's talk a little bit about some of the things that Shotgun could have done if he actually were capable of presenting an argument rather than just announcing the arguments that he does not, in fact, possess or even understand. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about the doctrine of divine simplicity. The doctrine of divine simplicity is a purely preposterous doctrine, right? It basically says that God's omnipotence, that every property that God has is the same property. So that from the standpoint of human cognition, right, we can distinguish between God's omnipotence, God's is good. God's nature is actually amoral. So the good only consists in God's commands. But God's omnipotence is God's omniscience, and is every other property that's predicated of God, right? But that just simply makes nonsense of the notion of predication, and ultimately is a form of theological non-cognitivism, right? It's basically saying that it's impossible to speak about God except in some analogical way. So anybody who holds to a view like that really can't say anything at all about God. And I can understand why Shotgun wouldn't actually give any arguments in defense of his theological worldview, given that he holds to the doctrine of divine simplicity. Because by virtue of holding that doctrine, he can't say anything coherent whatsoever about God, because it's just a nonsensical doctrine. I mean, just think about it, right? What would it mean to say that God's omnipotence is his omniscience and is every other property that's predicated of God, right? It doesn't mean anything. It's just pure nonsense. So let's leave that aside and assume that, for the sake of argument, let's just imagine like a slightly brighter bulb than Shotgun Smith. Probably not very hard to find, right, on the shelf. And imagine that he doesn't have anything so dumb as the doctrine of divine simplicity to go with. Could he actually defend divine command metaethics as a coherent metaethical theory? Well, there's some real problems there, right? Because, first of all, he has to tell us whether he can't say that God has a good reason for commanding that murder is wrong. He can't say that because he's saying that God looks to his own nature and then commands in accord with that nature. But if God's nature is amoral, and if the good consists merely in what God commands, then God doesn't have a good reason for issuing the commands that God issues, right? And the fatal problems here is the idea of arbitrariness. Basically, it just becomes arbitrary what God commands, right? So one way to think about this is to say, in virtue of what authority should we accept God's commands as authoritative? That is, in virtue of what does God's authority to issue these commands consist? That is to say, what makes it the case that God's commands are the right commands? Because anybody can issue commands, right? You just can go down the street and somebody can issue a command to you, right? So what Shotgun, if he were smart enough to actually give an argument, what he would actually need is some argument to show that God possesses that authority. But he can't actually appeal to God's goodness to say that God's authority or God's commands are authoritative, because he's saying that goodness consists merely in God's commands, and God's nature is itself amoral. He can't appeal to the fact that because God is good, his commands are authoritative. So, in fact, it's essentially a kind of mafioso view of um, of the good. Whoever has the biggest stick gets to decide what the good is, right? It's essentially a might makes right theology, or might makes right metaethics. And we can reject it out of hand just on that basis alone as preposterous. Because there just is no reason for us to think that because somebody has sufficient power to, send people to hell, that means therefore they are good, and that therefore their commands should be obeyed, not merely because it's practical to do so. You avoid going to hell, maybe, if you obey God's commands, not merely because of prudence, but because they actually possess moral authority, right? Now, another way to think about this is in terms of the naturalistic fallacy, right? It doesn't, there's a famous argument, sometimes known as Hume's law, uh, sometimes known as the naturalistic fallacy, that you can't derive an ought from an is, right? And that's merely a logical point, right? It doesn't actually follow from mere descriptions that one can infer some kind of prescriptive or normative fact. You can't derive an ought from an is. But the fact that God is powerful, right, wouldn't actually allow one to derive any normative um, facts from God's commands, right? The mere fact that God is powerful could not actually ground the normativity imputed to his commands. So that's just a basic mistake of logic. But Shotgun, who's never studied any logic and doesn't know the first thing about it, isn't aware of how to avoid that mistake. Well, being saddled with the being saddled with defending Reformed Christianity is no picnic in any case. So what? How much time do I have left? I mean, I can talk a little bit about how people try to get around these problems. 3 minutes. All right. Well, I guess the way in which people usually try to get around this problem, right, is not to say that God's nature is amoral, but to say that God actually is the good, and that's an a posteriori identification. That is to say, God is not God and the good. Saying God is good is not an outright tautology, because the good doesn't actually mean God's nature, but what the good is God's nature, right? Although we discover that after the fact, we don't know it a priori. That's the usual way people generally try to avoid the so-called Euthyphro dilemma, think they can find a way out of it. And that's a strategy you can see in Thomas Aquinas, and it's a strategy you can see in William Lane Craig. The fatal problem with that view, though, is a dilemma at the level of God's nature, right? In other words, we can ask, are the properties of God's nature good by virtue of the fact that they are in God, or does God have the nature that he has because it's in conformity with the good? And so then again, you're caught in this dilemma of either having an arbitrary nature, something that I intimated earlier to Shotgun, which he wasn't able to address, not atypically, since he can't address any arguments. Or alternatively, you have to acknowledge a standard independent of God's nature, which God conforms to, which is to take the first horn. Well, I'm probably running out of time, so I just want to apologize to all my black friends that I have given a platform to a vile racist like Shotgun, but I felt like it was worthwhile to take the opportunity to make a fool out of such a cowardly idiot as he. So I yield the mic.
And I apologize to all my white nationalist friends for speaking with a Jew. No, I really do appreciate you guys giving us this platform. Are the admins going to allow us to have some question and answer time now? Thank you. I yield the mic.
Yeah, at this moment in time, we'll have some questions. If anybody listening has any, please step up to the mic and address the opponents. Thank you.
First, I'll ask a question to Shotgun and then probably Angst. Shotgun, just I don't understand your reason for conflating morality with God. It seems to cause more problems than solutions. It seems that if you argue that it's a product of rationality that God gave us, then you don't have to mess with the Euthyphro dilemma. You don't have to talk about God's essences and nature and stuff like that. So I was just curious as to why, for you personally, that's your strategy in arguing for moral realism. Thanks for.
Well, as a Christian, I'm obligated to obey scriptures and teach whatever scripture teaches. We have to, what'd you say, conflate ethics with our theology? I mean, I just define ethics just is applied theology. By the way, I don't think your suggestion helps the situation. If God rights our individual natures or our individual emotional whims with objective ethics of some sort, then we still have the problems. You're just pushing it off into a different area. Thank you. I yield the mic.
No, it's not. I mean, if you say that God gave us our cognitive abilities, I mean, he basically gave us life and gave us the ability to be rational, reasonable people, you know, we're made in God's image, then that means that we should be rational, moral creatures and be able to be capable of, you know, acquiring language, understanding mathematics, science, and morality should just be another process, another thing that's unique to human beings, that along with reason comes rationality, and we can determine based on some given variables or a moral dilemma of some kind that it would be, you know, logical for us to just assume that our cognitive faculties are reliable and our moral intuitions are reliable. And so, you know, we can work out these moral dilemmas, and it's not required by God. The problem I have, and I'm not saying this to go against you, I'm just asking you a question. When people, well, anyway, I'll just let you answer that question rather than put too much on there. I'm just saying that's how I look at it. Your mic.
You still have the problem, Bigfoot, of what makes moral propositions true or false. I mean, ultimately, as Christians, we're going to have to find what the truth-making properties of moral propositions in God somehow. I mean, if it's just an aspect of our nature, which I do happen to agree with, I do happen to agree that God has given us moral natures. That's part of the situational perspective in John Frame's triperspectival ethical position. God has written the law on our hearts, so we do have that aspect to it. But I just think I don't see how you're going to get away from this problem. I mean, you're still going to have to find the truth-making properties of a moral proposition. Thank you. I yield the mic.
Oh, hello. It's not clear to me whether we're talking about moral epistemology or moral ontology. If we're talking epistemology, I would say the principle of credulity that, you know, theologians like Swinburne heavily rely upon justifies morality. It certainly appears to be the case that certain moral principles are true. Oh, I'm kind of aiming this at both Bigfoot and Shotgun. But yeah, so I don't really see a problem there with justifying our belief in morality. That much seems pretty self-evident. When we're talking about ontology, now this is a question I'm directing at Shotgun. If we're talking about ontology, why is the reduction of moral obligations to divine commands and moral values to divine nature any better than any other moral naturalistic reduction, right? Like, why can't we just reduce good and evil to pain and pleasure, or to altruism, or any what? Because of metaphysics? Well, you're gonna have to get up on mic because that doesn't really make any sense. But yeah, that's pretty much my question. It doesn't seem that divine command theory is any better than any other reductionistic theory of morality. But next.
Can I put the next question to Angst? I get a one. Okay, Angst. Now, when you argue for moral nihilism, you say that there has to be an independent objective referent, and indeed that's what Shotgun is arguing, and that independent objective referent is God. But what I think that if you say that there needs to be an independent objective referent, but you're making a metaphysical claim. You're saying that there needs to be an independent objective referent, but there isn't one, and you're just not in a position to say that. So basically, you start out with relativism. You say that there's variation in people's behavior and stuff like that, just like there would be in you know, biologically there's variation, but it's all dependent on the human species. And so what I'm saying is it just seems like a somewhat of a circular argument, because you say that morality is subjective, But you can't really provide an objective argument for that. You can just point to the non-controversial aspect of moral relativism, but you can't objectively prove that morality is subjective. So it just seems like a position of skepticism, and until we can empirically verify that there's an independent empirical psychology, something like that, then we're at a standstill. Would you agree with that? Mike's free.
Well, no. The way that I argue for it is to undertake an analysis of what moral language being used in a kind of way have to mean. In other words, what kind of properties could people have in mind when they talk about something being objectively right or objectively wrong, and so on, right? And so if you do an analysis of that kind, it turns out that it's not really a coherent coherent claim to say something like murder is objectively wrong, right? Because essentially what people are trying to do is saying that there are these kinds of reasons that could exist independently of the aims or desires of the agent, right? You have a reason to do this independently of your aims and desires, right? In metaethics, these are sometimes called external normative reasons, right? Sometimes they're called categorical imperatives, so as to be distinguished from hypothetical imperatives, right? And so if you undertake an analysis of what it could actually mean for there to be reasons untethered to an aim or desire, the very concept falls apart for various reasons. I mean, it's a fairly intricate analysis we don't have to go into here. But once you undertake that analysis, it sort of shows that moral realism can't actually be a coherent view. That's the reason why I reject it, because the actual claim, such and such is objectively wrong. You have an external normative reason, a categorical external normative reason, independently of your aims and desires, to not murder someone, not torture someone, whatever it is. That's just not a coherent claim. But that requires a fair amount of analysis. I yield the mic.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I have to go, but I'll hang out long enough to give anybody any last words that they want to throw in my direction, or any last insults that they want to level at me. I'll be here for another few minutes, and you can get it out of your system. Thank you. I yield the mic.
Sorry, yeah, I'll just repeat what I said before. If we're talking about a reduction of moral values, why is it that God's nature is the best metaphysical theory of moral value, right? And I could level a same question about obligations. It just doesn't seem as if these theistic theories have anything to them that naturalistic theories don't have. Okay, your turn.
Yeah, I forgot you asked that. Sorry about that. If I were going to argue against that sort of position, I mean, obviously we would have to discuss which position you're bringing up, because I don't think even you would relinquish that you would try to group all moral realist positions together and say that they all stand or fall in the exact same way. I mean, they each require their own criticism. As does Christianity. I mean, if we throw Christianity in as a moral realist position with all the rest, then we would have to critique it individually. And without knowing which individual position we're talking about, what I would do as a Christian would be to try to vindicate the truth of Christian metaphysical claims over and against the truth of a utilitarian or an instrumentalist or whatever moral realist I'm trying to talk with. But I agree with you. In theory, if the moral realist can come up with some sort of moral realist position that operates like it's supposed to, then it would be just as good as a divine command theory would be. But that's that's a big if. If they can come up with something that works, I don't think they can. at any rate, I'll hear Revelation false. Okay, Relinquish, you got your hand up. I'll let you respond, but I'm not going to respond back. I'll give you guys the last word. And thanks again for the admins for sponsoring this and not being mean. Thanks to the admins for being fair. And yeah, I appreciate you guys setting this up and hosting this. So thanks. I yield the mic.
Well, Shotgun, I wanted to see how far you were going to go before you had to go. I think you started off by saying that Sam Harris was a moral realist. So maybe sometime we could examine whether or not, in fact, Sam Harris is a moral realist. Have you read Sam Harris, Shotgun? Do you think he's a moral objectivist? Really? Do you want to hang around for a little bit and see whether or not that's true? What have you read from Sam Harris where you think that he lays out that he's a moral realist? Exactly. Okay. So what, did you read The Moral Landscape or something like that? Yeah, I don't think that's what you want to argue, that Sam Harris is a moral objectivist or a moral realist. We can get into that sometime if you'd like, because there's a lot of people, including atheists, I think, who are a little bit confused on Sam Harris's view. Pass the mic.
Yeah, well, to answer you, Shotgun, we could just as easily we could just as easily as you want to say that facts about moral value just reduced to facts about God's nature. We could say facts about moral value reduced to facts about pain and pleasure, right? Or facts about selflessness or selfishness, which I kind of like. I think it makes a lot of sense to reduce moral value to selflessness and selfishness, such that an evil thing is always a selfish thing and a good thing's always a selfless thing. So yeah, you can kind of see where I'm going. Why choose this one property and arbitrarily say, okay, so godlikeness, that's going to be what we equate morality to, when there's a million other properties out there, like altruism and pleasure and pain and all these sorts of things that appear at face value to be morally significant. Uh-oh, what's going on? Oh, my screen just turned off. And yeah, anyways, I'll get off. I'm starting to ramble.
Okay, at this time, we're just going to close up the debate. The admins here at Believers versus Non-Believers would like to thank both Angstreich and Shotgun Smith for coming and having a nice, respectable debate. We thank everybody for coming by the room and listening. And special thanks to everyone who came and asked questions. So thanks everyone once again, and enjoy yourselves.